All right, I think we're good to go. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you happen to sit on this Wednesday. Welcome to the Inclus webinar on the topic of ISO 31000 standard for risk management, why this standard exists and what it means for you. We will be recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the recording with all registrants afterwards. So rest assured you will even though you might not be able to attend today, you will get your hands on the recording. Briefly about the agenda today, it's very simple. Let's start with introductions and then our speaker today, Mark Bolt, and Miki Langevainio will be discussing the topic of the day. And then towards the end, we will have a Q&A session. But remember that you can send in questions and comments throughout the session, and we will try and pick those like as we go. So let's try and keep this interactive as well. But in any case, towards the end, we will have this Q&A session. But yeah, without further ado, I think, gentlemen, the floor is yours. Maybe you'd like to start with the brief introductions.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Irkku, for the nice introduction to today's topic. I'm always interested in our guests' backgrounds because that often reveals a bit about the approach, perhaps the theory and practice that you've been using, and what's your angle to the standard of ISO 31000. So, Mark, it would be great if you could give a little overview on your extensive career and what industries you've been working at, and how do you see the development of the standard in the big picture before we go to the actual content.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Miki, for inviting me to be part of the webinar. Yeah, my background is in risk management for what I call the major accident industries, very much looking at those accidents and how you manage them, but also going all the way up to looking at how organizations should sort of manage, or how they manage and control their more strategic risks and other types of risks across a range of areas. And so I've worked in things like chemicals, petrochemicals, oil and gas, with government agencies, healthcare, maritime, aviation, amusement industries, etc. And I think of relevance here to 31000 is I am a member of the UK committee that oversees the development of risk management standards, both within the UK, which would be under BSI, or internationally under ISO. And I'm also a member of some of the ISO committees as well, which are linked into the risk management area. I think those are probably the most relevant things. And I'm a member of, and in fact, a certified fellow of the Institute of Risk Management. So I think that hopefully that gives a reasonable background before we go and start talking about ISO's principles, ISO 31000's principles, I should probably say.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark, for the nice intro. Well, the whole standard is a sort of a principle-based framework. What does it mean to begin with? What is the standard? What is it for?
Okay, well, what we mean by principles based is that the standard sets out, so you could say, guiding principles, things which we should take into account when we are developing and setting up our risk management approaches. And in a way that delivers good practice. And okay, we set them up as we follow the sort of cycle within a framework development and improvement cycle. Whereas if you compare that with a prescriptive standard, that would really set out a detailed set of rules or steps, you could say, or procedure, which you would need to go through to comply with the standard. So ISO 31000 sets out the what's and the why guidance for delivering good risk management. It provides, you could say, the concepts or the fundamental concepts which underpin risk management. It doesn't dictate to you how you have to do it. So it's the what and why, not the how. It is designed so that it can be flexible. And the reason you want to be flexible is because risk management is applicable in organizations of all different sizes. So the standard is setting it out to give you the what's and the whys such that you can do the how to fit to your organization, whether it be small or large, regardless of industry or market you're in, taking into account cultural things and context. And so simply you could say ISO 31000 is a standard which provides flexible guidance rooted in sort of key values or philosophies. It's not a checklist.
Good one. I often want to sort of start with some sort of stimulation, intellectual stimulation on the broader why. I read a nice quote from James Lamb's book about implementing enterprise risk management, and he sort of clearly stated there that if you're going to ignore risk, you do it at your own peril or at your own cost. So that's well said. That you can ignore risk, but then you're willing to bear the cost. And the whole idea of the risk management processes and standards and frameworks is to be more conscious about the risks. It's basically how the organization becomes conscious of the risks that they are actually either taking or facing that are imposed to them. So coming from there, what are the principles that the ISO 31000 risk management standard states that are best practices to be following?
Okay, well, there are 8 principles, which simply put are integrated, i.e. risk management should be integrated, risk management should be structured and comprehensive, it should be customized, it should be inclusive, and I think if we can so people can read them, you can do the second slide at the moment, Mickey, because I think it's on the first slide. It should be dynamic. That's okay, don't worry. I think this is just so people can read them. It should be dynamic, best available information. It should take into account in the way you design it human and cultural factors, and there's a principle of continual improvement. And in a way, what you should say is that regardless of sort of the size or type of organization you're in, or the environment you're in, all of these principles are valid, and they are the foundation that you would have to effective risk management, and you should be considering them as you establish, as you review and improve how you do risk management. And the whole point of the whole lot is that they then deliver, you could say, the purpose of risk management, which is value creation and protection. So it's about, you could say, opportunities and threats, and it's about, therefore, hence, value creation and protection.
That's a great one. So if we dive into the individual principles, what would you like to start with?
Well, we might as well start at the top of the image just to talk about it, and so it's probably, I think it's worth thinking about what do each of these mean. So the first principle is integrated, which really means that risk management is part of everything else you do. It is not a standalone, siloed activity, and it should be a natural part of what you do. That means it's within your management systems and your governance arrangements. It could be, say, your operational management systems, your safety management systems, your quality management systems. Risk management is embedded within it. It's not a standalone activity. So you would see it in all of those sort of areas. In the way it goes. And that, I mean, I did some work once with an oil company for their drilling process. We looked at the drilling process and we built into the drilling process for developing and drilling a well where risk management activities should take place. The proactive risk activities, the assurance activities, and so on. I can go on to I'll go on if you wish to some of the others.
Yeah,
would you like to add on integrated?
Yeah, if I can add one point that is often coming up with our clients, and what is also it's a technical question, but it's also a leadership and management related governance issue, is how does risk management, how is it integrated into decision making? How does it actually either direct decision making or advise decision making in terms of what are the risks of different options, for example, strategic options. And I can quickly show how we've done it in Inclus in practical terms, as often the impact of the risk assessments is broken down into possibly reputation impact, financial impact, production impact on production and quality, and so on, depending on the sort of impact matrix that the organization is using. But often then there's a question, what is the impact to the strategic objectives? And how we've done it is that we sometimes do it so that we have an impact of certain risks, which is the sort of overall impact, looking at the different impact categories. But then we might specifically want to ask, what is the impact on strategic objectives on top of that? Because you have certain risks that have impact on protecting your processes. And strategy is often about what we want to capture in the future, what markets we want to sort of engage into, what are our must-win battles, what are the strategic objectives. And when we change that viewpoint, impact to impact and to strategic objectives, we might have a little bit different priority based on the impact. And we can then sort of look at what would be the risks that have the highest overall impact, but also impact on the strategic objectives. And you can even dissect the objectives one by one and then compile all the objectives overall impact, or then just to look at one impact category. But just wanted to give this as one sort of takeaway on the practical integration of risk management into decision making.
Okay, no, that's great, and it sort of illustrates, you could say, integrated in terms of saying within a certain area, strategic. In that case, you would have the risks that you would look at for making decisions within the strategic activities or process you are going through. So that's fine. I think the next of the principles, if you went around the circle, is structured and comprehensive. And this is probably links back to your comment at the beginning. If you ignore something, then you can get hit in the back by it because you weren't planning or whatever. So the comprehensive bit is you should be looking at everything about your business organization. There's a defined scope, and the scope, and if you remember, the risk process starts with context, and you're meant to look at internal and external context, and therefore you're looking at both inside and outside. You could say, some people would use the term also extended enterprise, and structured is to ensure that you go through the full process and you don't start to miss things, and you do it in a logical manner. And also you bring structure in to help enable consistency in the way you might assess a risk, and hence when you make decisions, it is all about informing the decisions because you've got a full picture in a consistent manner. It can support things like allocating resources in the way you do things. And of course, if you aren't comprehensive, you will miss areas, and if you miss areas, you could miss some unintended or undesired outcomes and things that could happen, but you could also miss some opportunities. So that's sort of structured and comprehensive. And I think a lot of that you'll find, I think, as within the sort of tools like Inclus, they are probably helping out with that. If I go on, I don't know if you want to add anything now, or shall I go on?
Maybe if I just touch upon on sort of each of these a little bit from how we apply it on Inclus. So what we for example do often is that on the comprehensive part is that you can start with let's say tabula rasa. You can start with an empty table and start brainstorming on what is the sort of risk universe that we should be looking at. But then others have perhaps already laid out risk universe, all the taxonomy categories that they should be looking at. But that might also kill some of this sort of creativity and sort of human thinking. But we often like some sort of combination that you start with a seed list of risks that are actually relevant for you, and then you start identifying more to it. But we also have an AI tool where we can then find blind spots in our sort of comprehensiveness, if you will, and just gonna show you quickly how we do it. So if you have risk registry and you have strategic risks, for example, and you have operational and so on, you might be very comprehensive already, but we can ask the AI if we have missed a complete risk category to begin with. And we can see that, okay, well, legal is in the regulation, market is in strategic. Not necessarily this would be justified as new categories. But then if we look at then if there's certain supply chain risks, are we missing something on those? So we can then have a look at individual risk category and the blind spots that we have in the current approach. So this is the way how we can then sort of look at whether we have been comprehensive enough, at least when it comes to the actual risk universe. But it's really a challenge how to be agile and how to be comprehensive as possible, because you always have to somehow restrict the universe that you're looking at a particular time. And then you need to have a process that allows and makes it sort of robust and comprehensive over time, because you can't be comprehensive always immediately at this point. But using tools like this might stimulate the thinking. This is not to replace the human thinking, and we truly feel that humans have to empty, let's say, their risk identification before we use the AI, so that we don't create sort of a maybe anchoring effect or sort of a confirmation bias or something, that we draw information from an AI and then we start looking into it without us actually thinking about the risks properly. But this is just an example on how to make the risk register more comprehensive.
That's great, thanks. That's to add to that. So a risk taxonomy helps you in structure, not just in analysing, assessing, but also in reporting. And you do want it to be comprehensive, but comprehensive is also not just all the types of risks, it's all of the things you do and making sure you're covering all of those. And it's understanding also the external factors that come in. If I move on to the next principle, is customized. And this is really, I think I sort of said a bit about it earlier on, it is reflecting the fact that not all organizations are the same. So there is not one way of doing things that is right for everybody. So you can therefore, you're expected, you could say, to tailor your risk management. Your tailoring would be based on things like the internal, external context. Internally, we're talking about things like, what are our strategic objectives? What's our strategy? What is our risk appetite? How much risk are we willing to take to try and achieve our strategy? Those sort of things need to come into it. And we also need to recognize who internally, if you think about it, if you're a small organization, you'll have a different number of resources, you'll have closer proximity, you could say, to those who are perhaps doing the work and the people at the top. So you won't necessarily have the same risk approach as if you were in a very large organization, and certainly you wouldn't want to copy what is in a large organization. So I think that is probably relevant things to think about. I have seen in areas where people sort of go off and, for example, any organizations just grab something like a risk matrix off the internet and then use it. It's not always the best way to work. You do need to you should sit back, and when you're thinking about what you're doing, is say, no, what is right for us? How do I make it right for us? How do I make it customized and therefore tailor it to me? And clearly,
yeah.
in software, you can tailor your software. I know that.
Yeah, but truly, it always comes from us discussing together with the customer. What are their resources? What are the stakeholders? What is the frequency and time span of the sort of reporting, possibly on risks? What is the ambition level? That we have to always customize the process to fit into a particular customer's own organization. And also, it's a matter of sort of intellectual customization that, for example, risk criteria should be considered by the client on what they are protecting. Impact probability is a good one, often sort of as a generic framework, but also the ISO31000 standard sort of suggests that you can innovate around the risk criteria, that what would be making most sense to you. Do you want to emphasize perhaps the cost impact, or do you want to emphasize perhaps also the opportunities clearly in the risk assessment, and so on. So how we often do is that we have that discussion about the risk criteria, whether they're actually sort of measuring what we want to protect in the first place, and then we tailor basically those criteria according to the customer's needs. Some want to be really specific on cost impact, having the minimum and maximum impact of risk cost, or then most likely, and so on. So you can have 3-pointer assessments. And some want to be more broad. When we are talking about strategic risk, you might want to ask, does this trend, for example, pose a threat to us or an opportunity from 1 to 5, which is very vague often. But that's enough for that kind of process, that you are steering the strategy, or you're just looking at what the horizon and prioritizing against large trends, for example. But that point about the risk appetite is a great one. And I think that when you facilitate the discussion with the leadership on the risk appetite, how we've done it sometimes is that we ask them to rate certain risk categories or risks based on the appetite that they're ready to take. And then we can also sort of measure how far our residual risk is from our risk appetite, and hence what is the risk reduction need still on that particular risk. But of course, it requires a stage where you do define the risk appetites, either risk category by category or risk by risk. But it's an interesting process where you then have another type of prioritization, where you see that where we are farthest from the actual risk level that we want to take, or the risk tolerance. But this is something that then is really requiring the top management to be engaged and actually take stance on the risk. What is the risk appetite?
Okay, that all to me is very logical statement on how you can do something. I think the next bit, or the next principle, going around the circle of the principles, which are not in any particular order, I should say, is dynamic. And this is important. Certainly, if you think about today's world, we certainly say that we are changing faster than ever before. We've got new technologies coming in. We've got other changes, going to be things like political decisions, new regulations. What our competitors do, we get new competitors in which we don't necessarily expect, and so there's loads of change going on. So we also have at the same time things which are evolving, where you could say there's changes happening which we don't necessarily pick up immediately because they are all small incremental changes. So We need the risk management to be able to be dynamic so that it is picking up what's happening. It's identifying what changes are occurring, what's going on, both the ones which might be small incremental ones, which you could say are early warning to what could be happening in the future, plus sort of step change ones. We need to pick them up. We need to be identifying them, understanding what that means for the risks to our organization. That is both the opportunities and the threats, obviously. And then we need to respond, which also means that if we recognize change happens fast, we need to be setting ourselves up as an organization to be resilient. If a change happens, we're able to cope with changes and as they come along. You could say we need our risk management side needs to be, you could say in some ways, anticipatory and responsive in nature. But all of that can come under the word dynamic. I think that's probably the simplest. And I know there are things you're doing, I believe, Mickey, around things like horizon scanning and monitoring.
Truly, and we sort of not even necessarily yet integrating the sort of external data sources into be more informed about the risks and the sort of early warnings or indicators around those risks. But the first stage is actually to conduct the risk assessment in a regular fashion so that you can then understand which are on the rise in terms of the risk impact or likelihood. And there, what we often do is that we compare the previous assessments to the current one. For example, if you do it quarterly, you might be looking at a particular risk that was really low in quarter one. For example, in this picture here, it would be customer complaints risk, but it's on the rise a bit. Not worrying, but the trend is important. So when we add a third sort of a principal third quarter to it, then there might be something that has indicated that we have problems here, and now we really have problems with this. So the direction is important, and in a similar fashion, we might have risks that were high, but with robust mitigation, we are seeing that we are having an impact on the reduction of the risk. So then we see that we are having effective risk controls. Essentially, we are able to bring them down. Of course, there might be external factors that are bringing them down as well, but often the risk mitigation actions are the ones that you then are able to sort of reduce the risk score. So these are quite drastic changes from quarter to quarter. What you mentioned is typically incremental, and the direction from quarter to quarter is more important than how much it has leaped. Of course, that's important, but we often look at, is it going down or is it coming up? And that in itself is always an indication if the risk is going up, because then you assume that it's still going up until we do something about it. So that's a great segue into the models that we use.
Okay, no, that's good. I think that's a nice way of saying trend analysis is part of you could say your horizon scanning and all your other work to try and identify what's changing. So which is good, and I think we'll probably come back to that a bit later if we can. The next of the principles is that risk management should be based on the best available information. Now, we've sort of talked just a minute ago about the world is changing fast. So you could say that when we've been operating something for a long time, we've got good information on it. When we've been doing certain jobs, activities, projects, whatever they may be, we know how to do them. But there are going to be other things which are changing, and therefore we may not have the best information. But what we want reliable, timely, relevant information that we use in our ways of understanding and assessing the risks, how well they're managed, what level of assurance are we getting from things, all of the things we need to know in order to manage risk. If we have limitations or uncertainties where we still are using the best available information, but we just don't have good enough information, then we should acknowledge that. And some people would say if we have limitations and uncertainties, we should also take a precautionary principle. So if you've got an area of risk where the information from which we can use to understand the risk is limited, we should probably be thinking about, okay, we should be responding perhaps a bit more to this or a bit more precautionary. You could argue what happened in COVID. COVID happened. We were realizing a risk, you could say, at that stage. The precautionary principle, everybody locked down. And then we went out and tried to get better information. And from better information, we were able to understand better ways of managing the situation. So same concepts within the risk management world.
Truly. And one sort of, I don't know, is it a substandard within the ISO 31000 family is about the emerging risks and threats. And there's a sort of a annex or separate standard 1050. If we look at that sort of quickly, I can show you the principles or the basic idea of it. So here we would be having the so-called risk intelligence cycle that the ISO 31050 suggests that you create in order to have a essentially dynamic enough risk management process that you can sort of foresee those emerging risks which might be more, let's say, less likely in probability, but still having a high impact. So what they propose in the standard is that you have the risk management process as described in the ISO 31000 from risk identification, analysis, evaluation, treatment, but you essentially understand what are the uncertainties in your risk assessment, where you have actually confident answers and where you have enough evidence and proof that you can base your risk assessments on. And then if you start adding those more emerging and hard to detect risks, you tend to not have that much evidence. And you have to create a risk intelligence cycle to work beside the risk management process, which is then feeding into the risk management process. And here it's a super complicated picture here. I don't know why they made it this sort of messy, but having a bit of background also in intelligence myself, I know this cycle very well, and you could basically just sort of summarize it into this. So you have risk analysis, and then you might ask yourself what information we are missing. So what are the information requirements, intelligence requirements we need to answer? Then we need to collect that data with some sort of sensors or data sources. We have to process that data. Is it reliable data? Does it answer to the questions? Then you have to analyze and do a sort of intelligence fusion of the data. You have to give an assessment and so on. And you typically tend to create a report and disseminate it somehow. But in this process, rather than reporting, you add the information into the risk management process, which typically means that you are just updating the risk information of the risks, the description, any added updates on the risk, and so on. And then again, you do the cycle again and again when you have uncertainty in the risk management process. And how we in practice do it is that we often use sort of data buckets that we answer a particular risk. So we collect data, and this is also from the ISO 31050, the Dicky process from data, information, knowledge to intelligence, sort of. But it's not enough to collect data because it doesn't tell you anything. You have to, create it as a meaningful information, turn it into some sort of knowledge, and at the end of the day, actionable intelligence, and what is the sort of relevance for this particular intelligence question. And how we've done it on Inclus at times is, for example, we sometimes use external data sources like in the assessment of oil market development scenarios that we recently did to understand what are the outlooks for the basically fuel prices in the world. and we compiled a data bucket of 8 reports from the best possible sources on this particular question. And then we created scenarios with AI, with indicators and scenarios from what is actually driving the price to go high, scenario number 1, all the way up to scenario 16, driving the low prices. And then we have the indicators, and we have also the evidence based on that AI assessment and sort of drawing sort of from those sources and creating an audit trail that from this report, from this page, it states that the evidence on this is high. And from there, we can then see what is the evidence on particular scenario, or on the indicators of that particular scenario. And then, of course, the organization should be thinking about what is the impact of those indicators or those scenarios to themselves. And then we can start activating other scenarios. And from here, we can start looking at scenarios which has likely indicators with high evidence already at this hour. So we can then sort of create the most likely scenario as of today from the multiple scenarios if they are not mutually exclusive. So this is a way how to integrate the best available information on a particular risk, which is oil price, for example. And we can do really thorough analysis with the AI and more sort of get evidence-based assessments beside the human evaluation of risks. Of course, we always want to expose the AI assessment to humans as well to validate the results. But this is one way to do it.
Okay, that's good. And what it's really saying is the best available information gives us the best available understanding of our risks, which means we can make the best decisions at any time. But also, when we make those decisions, we should be cognizant of any uncertainties that we have in our data source and take that into account.
Maybe just a quick addition on that. That one important point and concept that has been really hard to implement is the concept of key risk indicators, and that should be a central part when you're collecting data on a particular risk, because those are the factors and the metrics that are telling you whether the risk is becoming more likely or not. And I rarely see the implementation of key risk indicators almost in any setting, because it's an intellectually challenging endeavor to actually come up with those. But we have now also enabled AI to look at those indicators. So if I show you quickly another example on how to integrate key risk indicators, we might want to look at for example, let's take a regulation risk. We might want to understand different kind of regulation here. And we can ask the AI then what would be the key risk indicators of us not adhering or monitoring the regulation properly. So we can ask, the number of pending or upcoming regulatory changes, frequency and results of third-party compliance audits related to risk management software, percent non-compliance incident detected. So this kind of KPIs, the AI is able to create virtually on any risk that we wanted to look at. Of course, you can change those, but that's at least a starting point where you can ask the AI what would indicate this, and then you can say that no, that's not a good indicator, this is a better one. And then you at least have those indicators, even though you don't have data on those indicators. But just having the indicators make the assessment more accurate, because then all the people who are assessing that risk considers those indicators. So that's one thing how to integrate the best available information.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll step on, as we've got time stepping on as well. The next principle is referred to as human and cultural factors. And what we're saying here is, I mean, a lot of people will do risk studies and will look at things and say, okay, what can go wrong due to human and cultural factors? But here we're also talking about, think about human and cultural values in the way you develop and design and implement and improve your risk management systems, processes, everything. We do not expect necessarily, thinking back to customization, that you'll have exactly the same way of working if you're an international organization, because cultures in, say, Southeast Asia, America, and Europe are all different. So we may need to think about how do we deal with that as we design how we undertake risk management. We've talked a bit about inherent biases already, so sort of, and Mickey sort of gave some sort of examples about how the tool can deal with it. But that sort of thing is what we're thinking about. Is there going to be something which is in the way we work is different between all of the different countries? And that may be differences in speaking up. That could be differences in willingness to take risk. Yet we're wanting to have a consistent sort of risk appetite. So that's what we mean about human and cultural principle. It's making sure we undertake risk management, understanding the human and cultural factors that are influencing our people so that we do the risk management well and in a consistent way. And should I just go on to continual improvement as well? Continual improvement is a principle. You probably see it at the end of a lot of standards, but here it's just like everywhere else. It's making sure that we learn from our experience and then we make changes based on our experience. Obviously, we will also look to make improvements. You could say as we mature more, we could look to make improvements as there are new technologies which can help us. And we've been talking a lot about AI and how can that help risk management so far today. But the continual improvement cycle is to understand what we're doing well, what we're not doing so well, what do we need to change to make sure we better manage our risks. And these may be changes in our framework, they could be changes in our processes, but they could also be changes in how we manage specific risks, for example. And that's you could say the last of the 8 principles. So, Mickey, did you have anything to just summarize there, or would you like to progress on with questions?
Yeah, well, maybe if I add on that bit, so we have sort of cultural differences when it comes to sort of nationalities and different countries, but I think that almost bigger sort of tribes or cultures are within the organization when we are talking about different functions. Are we talking with the legal team, which is full of lawyers typically? Are we talking about the marketing team? Are we talking with the innovation department? Are we talking with project managers? Are we within a project? Are we talking with architects or are we talking with engineers? And so on and so on. I think that, and that's the value actually of risk management and inclusive risk management and sort of the development of the culture that takes into account these human and cultural factors, that you have diverse opinions and viewpoints and expertise to bring into the process. And that's basically pretty much the key feature that we have always adhered to at the Inclus is the inclusive part, hence the name Inclus. And then we've been using the tool for collaborative conflict analysis and still actually work on various conflicts around the world on basically conflict analysis, where the different cultures are truly at present. And one important thing is actually to use their own language. So that's why we have been embedding into Inclus tool an ability to translate quickly the risk criteria that you want to evaluate into other languages. So you can have the default language in Inclus, then you can, for example, do the same, all the guidance and criteria, etc., all the risks and everything you can automatically translate into any language. Of course, then you want to have perhaps an expert to just check if the terminology is right and so on. But we can virtually have like 15 different languages within a risk management session that everybody can use their own language, so they can then change from English to Ukrainian, for example, when they are doing an assessment here. And that's really important, that you always take into consideration that the terminology, even for Finns, we don't have English as our base language. So there might be certain significant challenges to describe a risk in English sometimes and so on. But yeah, that's one aspect. And then of course all the risks are always evaluated with sort of collaborative viewpoint, where we can then see the distribution of the assessments and the rationale and judgments behind those assessments in a particular assessment, and we can then understand exactly the different viewpoints. And often the idea here is that there's different reasons for having differing views. Either we don't understand the risks in the same way, therefore we assess it in a different way. We experience the impact in different way because of our position in the organization, for example. We have a different knowledge base about risk, and we bring different viewpoints into the risk, and so on and so on. And then we have those human factors when we come to the workshop, for example, like you mentioned, we have always the hierarchies in the organization. Is the culture such that, the leaders talk and others, listen in silently, or is it engaging and open and transparent? And the tools that we are able to put together along with the process actually then reduces the challenge of the leadership to either engage and participate the different layers of the organization to actively participate, because it can be both ways. It can be so that the staff doesn't want to be engaged into the risk management process, or it's too burdensome or something, they're too busy, and then you have to be very streamlined and efficient. Or then it can be that the top management is not that willing to engage a lot of people into the process. But if you dissect it in the correct manner and you plan the process so that you can sort of ensure that the data is kept, for example, in their own workspaces, that the departments only see their own risk management views, and then the top management sees all of the integrated and consolidated data, you can tackle those hurdles and concerns that the organization might have around designing a inclusive collaborative risk management process. But yeah.
Okay, that's good. Thanks. I think we'd said we would talk a little bit about what you could say the relative importance of the different principles in some ways, although I'd argue they always are, for different maturity levels in the organization, as one of the things we had promised in covering in here.
Yeah.
What I think it's good to say is that it doesn't matter on the level of maturity. I could argue all the principles are there. And if you look at a maturity model, I've just pulled out the Institute of Risk Management's maturity model. Some of you may be members of the Institute of Risk Management, and so you can, in a sense, get access to this. And I'm slightly biased because I've also been involved in its evolution or developing evolution, and it draws on many other risk maturity models. But very typically, they have a number of levels. You tend to have a low maturity for those people who are new to something, through to a very high maturity for those who are managing, if I would say, we're managing very significant risks and therefore need to manage them superbly well. So you need to be really mature to succeed. And they use it going from levels called novice all the way through to natural. But if you actually look at some of the descriptors here, you'll see some of the descriptors also are picking up on words which you could say reflect the principles. And at the very top, you clearly should be fully aligned to all principles. And you've got words coming in here at natural, saying things like integrated, forward-looking, alert, dynamic. You can't put necessarily all language words in. You can see that there's some things which aren't quite so good if you look at something like nascent, where it says you would naturally be reactive, siloed, and aware. Now, obviously, we don't want to be siloed. We want to be integrated. Awakening, as it says. And we don't want to be reactive. We want to be proactive and things. And some of the principles there, what it's saying is, the characteristics are such that there are things which you need to address. If you're lower in the maturity, and you were saying, how do I go about things? Then how would you do that versus if you're higher in the maturity? So somebody who's sort of, you could say, a novice or perhaps a low nascent, they're not going to have too much in place. they are unlikely to have Inclus's model, to be honest, because they are at the early stages in their, say, maturity life cycle, or they are of such an organization that you don't need a highly mature risk management. We can discuss that sort of philosophically if we wanted to. But you would want to start off, if you were in charge of saying, let's move up the maturity levels, of being comprehensive and structured. So you'd want to understand all your risks, and you would want to assess them in a comprehensive, structured manner, because that would give you an idea where you need to focus to get the best benefit, to go up the maturity. And you would also want to go and do inclusiveness. You would want to go and talk to people. You'd want to go out, get information from them to understand what is happening in the organization today, and that helps you decide what you can lever and use. They'd be people who are perhaps using some tools in the organization. People can tell you about that. They're going to be people who perhaps doing bits of risk management. They may be doing them all slightly differently, but they can tell you about that. So you can start to think about all of those things and then the principles and say, right, how can we use this to improve and make a plan to go forward? So ultimately, if you're at the bottom and you're wanting to progress up, you may never have had a plan. You'd want to put a plan in place, but a good start point is a structured, comprehensive understanding of the risks of your organization and good lot of, I would say, inclusiveness and talking with people to find out what is in place and what you can lever. You can also from that perhaps understand some of the deficiencies. Have I got all the best data around the place and things like that? And you can bring that and try and address that in the plan. If you were part way up in terms of you've got a lot more in place, then you are likely to be starting off by sort of understanding what your maturity is if you wanted to. And some organizations, they will do a maturity assessment, but there may be also audits and reviews. And again, though, you would be starting to look at how well am I meeting the principles? Am I well integrated? Maybe in one area you are and another you aren't. Okay, let's try and integrate things in better. Have I got any issues with culture? Are the human things wrong? Do I need to change the way we do things? So something like a maturity assessment should be thinking about the principles and say, how well does what we do meet those principles, and how dynamic are we? How reactive are we? And understanding those sort of things. And in a maturity model, I would expect to see that. So that sort of is quite quick, but hopefully it gives a sort of a flavor of things to think about. If you're at different levels of maturity, need to sort of step back and assess yourself and think about how well do I comply with these principles, and things like a maturity assessment would help you do that.
That's a great summary of the discussion today and binding it to the maturity model. We often love to work with organizations, let's say from 2 to 5 on maturity level, and we often have that discussion that if you see that you would be on level 2, how do we raise the bar to how do we go to that level 3 at this year, for example? What kind of vision for 3 years we have in order to get to the level 4, and create a roadmap for continuous improvement.
Yes.
Because rarely you see organizations having maturity level 5 being integrated throughout all the sort of processes and products and so on, and then all the way to being sort of a dynamic and comprehensive all the time. So that's really a high bar in a sense.
And I think I would agree with you there. You can debate actually whether all organizations should be level 5. Maturity is not necessarily something where you need to be at the top. It depends on the inherent risk you're managing. You need to be at an appropriate level for your risk. And I would also agree that, well, at the bottom, you might well use spreadsheets and things. As you mature, you are more likely, and certainly for bigger organizations, a lot more likely to start to bring in systems to enable you to better manage the risk, to be more dynamic and everything. And that's where, if you're thinking about where you are today in the audience and what am I at, that's where you should be thinking about, okay, what tools do I need? What training culture, everything else, all the things you might need to start to take you up the levels. And a good maturity model, you should be able to read what's happening at each level and see therefore what it is you need to change. And in reality, almost all organizations will have something from different levels. There will be aspects of the way you work which may be a natural type level, and there'll be other aspects you might have which may be novice, hopefully not quite so extreme, but though that is a reality of the way we are.
Truly. Fantastic summary. Irmeli, I think that we don't have any questions in the questions and answers section.
But I have one.
Okay.
Good.
And this goes to both of you, because I was just thinking to myself when you were discussing these cultural things. I recall way back when I used to run the NPS program, like customer satisfaction, in an industrial company, and it was a very, very cultural thing, really. When we were looking at, I mean, it was a company that was run like headquartered in Finland, but it had like operations all over the place. And we were looking at the results of the NPS surveys, and if you go to the US, it was all like tens, like straight tens. And if you go to Japan, it was like twos or threes, like all the scores were in the red. And I'm just wondering if this is a phenomenon that can also be seen in risk management. I mean, in terms of how people culturally treat risks or assess risks. Do you like, does this ring a bell? Do you recognize this phenomenon?
Yeah. There are issues within risk management which can be cultural, and if I look at experience, I can remember doing some work with a pharmaceutical company in Southeast Asia, and we asked about we were looking at the incident records, and in the whole of Southeast Asia, there was only one country that had any records of incidents, and culturally that was Australia, and it was therefore, you could say, a more European reporting culture, as opposed to a culture where you don't want to offend people, so you don't want to report on them. I can remember we doing, culturally an audit, and the person, here's a simple example, the person wasn't wearing a hard hat as they were doing the morning checks, but their person was being observed doing the morning checks. It was pointed out by the auditor, but he doesn't have his hard hat on, to which the person shouted up to the guy, put your hard hat on. He put his hard hat on, and the auditor ticked that everything was okay, rather than seeing it as a learning process and saying, no, it's a cross, which I then corrected. So there are cultural things that can come up with the way it works. Now, what we need to do is to step back and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve, and understand, therefore, think about what do we do to change the way in which people behave, because it's not wrong. It's just saying that we're not getting to the end point we want because of behaviors. So it may be some of that results in training and education. It could be that you do something to perhaps bring somebody into a different culture, so they start to understand the two cultures and can go back and can effectively translate in, or find other ways of doing things like reports, which people don't feel is a blame thing, which it wasn't intended to be, but think about how we handle that.
Truly, I concur with everything that Mark just said. But fantastic talk with you, Mark, once again. I really appreciate you taking the time and effort explaining the principles to us. Irkku, would you like to then give a brief about the upcoming webinars and connection?
Indeed. And like I said, thank you, Mark. You have become a regular in our webinar so far. So thanks for being with us today. And I'd like to briefly advertise our upcoming webinars. On the 13th of November, we will be presenting. This is a product geared webinar, really. Like this is about mastering risk workshop facilitation using Inclus. So if you're already a customer, you might want to join, or if you're considering Inclus as a software, please join, and we will be going through tips and best practices in facilitating a risk workshop using Inclus as a software tool. And then, of course, feel free to contact Mark also directly. There's his email address, and this QR code leads to his LinkedIn profile. So feel free to be in contact. And of course, if you want a demo of Inclus, there's a QR code to sign up for that as well. But yeah, our time is up. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for your time, and let's stay connected.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. And
Bye-bye.
thank you for listening. Take care.
Take care.